The morning sun in Umuk village was supposed to bring warmth, but for Chiamaka it brought only reminders. The clay pot her father once carried to the stream leaned broken against the wall. The hoe he sharpened every Sunday before church lay rusting in the shed. And the chair he used to sit on, whistling while tying his wrappers, sat empty in the corner of the yard, a silence heavier than any sound. Her father had been gone 6 months, carried away by an illness the herbs could not cure, the prayers could not reach, and the money they never had could not chase away. Since that day, Chiamaka's mother, Mama Ifananya, had not laughed. She moved like a shadow through her own house, her voice soft, her eyes always red, her lips pressed into silence even when the neighbours whispered comfort. Chiamaka was only 14, but grief had made her old. She rose before the sun, tied her wrapper tight around her thin waist, and carried baskets to the farm that once needed 3 strong men to tend. Her hands blistered, her back bent, her stomach often empty, but she told no one. Not her friends at school, not the curious neighbour girls, not even her mother. She carried her mother's silence the way some people carry a baby, close, careful, without complaint. One evening, while she pounded cassava with arms that trembled from the day's labour, her uncle Emmanuel arrived. He was her father's older brother, a man with a voice that carried and a smile that looked like kindness if you did not watch his eyes too closely. He sat in the compound, clearing his throat. "Sister-in-law," he said smoothly to Mama Ifananya, "you know it is not easy for a woman alone to keep land. The weeds will laugh at you. The men will cheat you. Better you let me handle the farm. I will make sure you and the girl never lack." Chiamaka's hands froze around the pestle. She looked at her mother, waiting for her to speak, to fight, to claim what was theirs. But Mama Ifananya only lowered her eyes. Her silence was an answer. From that night Emmanuel took the land. He sold yam tubers without asking. He cut palm trees without counting. He pocketed money that should have fed the household. And each time he came with that same smooth smile and said, "It is for the best." Chiamaka wanted to scream. She wanted to stand in the square and shout, "This is theft, this is betrayal." But each time she opened her mouth, her mother's silence pressed against her like a hand. And so she carried it until her young shoulders stooped with a burden too heavy for even grown men. The neighbours began to whisper. "That girl works like a slave," they said. "Her uncle is eating her father's sweat." But no one stood up. No one wanted to quarrel with Emmanuel, who drank palm wine with the elders and gave offerings at the shrine. The suffering grew. Chiamaka's mother began to cough at night, her chest rattling like dry beans in a calabash. There was no money for medicine. Chiamaka thought of the coins Emmanuel hid in his wrapper, of the goats he sold, of the palm oil he traded in secret. She thought of confronting him, but each time she remembered her mother's bowed head, her sealed lips, her eyes that begged without asking. And then came the day her mother collapsed in the farm, the hoe falling from her hands, the soil swallowing her tears. Chiamaka screamed, a sound the birds carried to the whole village. She begged for help. She begged for medicine. She begged for her mother's life. But Emmanuel only shook his head and said, "It is God's will." That night as her mother lay fadding on the bamboo bed, Chiamaka sat beside her holding her hand. For the first time in months her mother spoke more than a whisper. "My daughter," she said, "I stayed silent because I thought silence would keep peace, but silence only fed betrayal. Promise me you will not carry it when I am gone." Her voice cracked, but her eyes were steady. "Promise me, Chiamaka, break the silence." The tears Chiamaka had hidden for months poured freely now, wetting the mat, soaking her mother's hand. She wanted to promise, but her throat closed. All she could do was weep, weep until her body shook, weep until her mother's chest rose one last time and fell like a door closing softly. That night the silence Chiamaka had carried cracked open, spilling into the village like a broken calabash spilling palm wine. She did not know it yet, but the girl who had once bent beneath silence was about to rise with a voice sharp enough to cut through lies, and it would tear open wounds the village had tried to cover. The night after her mother's last breath, the house held its breath too. Chiamaka sat on the floor beside the bamboo bed, both hands cupped around her mother's fingers as if warmth could be argued back into them. Outside, the wind moved through the plantain leaves like a person searching for something they couldn't name. Neighbours came and went with small offerings, salt, palm oil, whispers. Their eyes were kind, but their kindness kept tripping over Emmanuel's shadow at the doorway. He stood there like a gate, accepting condolences as if grief were his property. When it was time to wash the body, the old midwife from the next compound came quietly, her wrapper tied high, her voice low and stern in the way of women who had helped both arrivals and departures cross the same threshold. She touched Chiamaka's shoulder. Child, she said, there are things only hands can do. Cry later. Now help me. Together they lifted, rinsed, wrapped. The midwife hummed a tune that refused to be pretty. It sounded like rope pulled through rough wood. When they were done, she placed a small white cloth over Mama Ifananya's face and bowed her head. You have carried silence well, she whispered to the body, but you have left it too heavy. The burial was the kind that looks tidy from the road and ragged from inside it. Emmanuel spoke with his smooth voice about God's will and the duties of family. Men nodded in the way men nod when a speech relieves them from doing the thing the speech is about. Chiamaka stood still as a fresh-cut pole, her eyes two hot coins that refused to fall. When the first red earth hit the mat, her mouth opened, and something left her that she had been saving since her father died. No sound came. But people turned anyway, as if the silence itself had raised both hands. After the mourners left, after the lamps were lowered, after Emmanuel finished counting the condolence envelopes in a corner and thought he looked like a man counting prayers, Chiamaka went to the small stool where her mother had kept thread and needles and little secrets too small to deserve a hiding place. She pulled the stool close, turned it upside down, and felt around the undersides with fingers that had learned to find things by listening rather than seeing. A nail head snagged her skin. She hissed, then smiled despite herself. There, flat against the underside, was a cloth tied so tightly that the knot had become part of itself. She worked it with her teeth when her nails couldn't persuade. It gave. Inside was a scrap of paper, folded as small as a bean, and something harder, beads, dull from years of teaching themselves to be stone. The paper was not long, not official, not heavy with the signatures that make people behave even when they don't agree. But it was her mother's writing, the neat, rounded letters of a woman who had taught herself to write to surprise her husband with shopping lists that were also love notes. My daughter, it began, if my mouth cannot open in time, let this open for me. Your father and I kept a copy of the land boundary from when the elders first measured it. Your uncle knows this. He took the other copy the night he came with palm wine. The beads are my wedding beads. He promised to keep them for safety. I asked to wear them for your father's burial. He said they were lost. If you find this, do not carry silence. Carry this. Her eyes blurred. For a moment the room made a new sound, as if the walls had decided to help her breathe. She placed the beads around her neck, and the coolness shocked her skin into a memory that did not belong to her. A younger version of her mother laughing, the beads catching light, a hand, not Emmanuel's, lifting them gently to kiss the hollow at her throat. The vision dissolved before she could thank it. She folded the note and tucked it into her wrapper like a secret that wanted to be loud. Outside, a chicken decided to remember it was night. Emmanuel, in the next room, snored the careless snore of a man who had never learned to apologize. Morning arrived without asking if anyone was ready. In the square, women spread cassava sheets like surrender flags. Men argued about rain without consulting the sky. Children played allegiance games. Today it was who can cry fastest and stop first. Chiamaka walked into the square with her mother's beads glowing a quiet red against her chest and her back straight as a question. People turned. Whispers ran to catch up with the facts. Emmanuel saw her and smiled the kind of smile that had fooled many people for a long time because they wanted to be fooled. Niece, he said, spreading his hands wide as if to introduce her to air, this is not the day for quarrels. Respect your mother's memory. Grief makes the tongue clumsy. He reached for her shoulder the way men reach for something they have already priced. She stepped back, not fast, not rudely, but as if the air between them were a small shrine that she would not allow him to step on. Uncle, she said, and the word did not tremble, I am not here to quarrel. I am here to count. He blinked. To count what? What belongs to us, what you promised to keep, what you have been selling like water. A ring formed around them. Women with hands paused midair, men with mouths silently ready to offer advice, children who love any circle that suggests a spectacle. The midwife stood just outside the ring, her eyes the steady lamps that do not need oil. Emmanuel's smile stayed, but it lost some furniture. Ah, he said lightly, is this how children talk to elders in your school? Your mother just went to join your father, you should be in the house, not. Chiamaka lifted the folded paper. My mother left this for me, she said. She hid it when you began to count money that did not greet our door. She wrote that you took the other paper. She wrote that you took her beads. She touched them briefly and felt them answer like a pulse. I wear them now because she could not. For a moment the square was shy of sound. Then, as always, words arrived late and tried to cover the distance by running. Which paper? Someone demanded. What beads? Another echoed, as if beads were not staring at them like small suns. Emmanuel's voice rose to meet theirs. Anyone can write anything, he said too quickly. Even grief can write. Are we now making markets of feelings? This is family matter. We will settle inside. No, Chiamaka said, surprising herself with how small the word looked and how large it sounded. Inside is where silence grows fat. Here is where it must be thinned. The catechist, who had been looking for a moment to flex scripture, stepped forward. Children must be guided, he began, and women must be listened to when they name the shape of their pain, the midwife finished without looking at him. Today we will try a new recipe, less sermon, more hearing. The elder from Umuri, who had supervised land boundaries when men still respected the distance between a neighbour's yam ridge and their hunger, shuffled forward slowly, as if slowness could press wisdom into the ground with each step. He squinted at the paper. He didn't say but the air did it for him. I remember this drawing, he said, tapping the ragged edge where a charcoal line had drawn a crooked square with a stubborn confidence. He pointed to a mark that looked like an accident but wasn't. This was my hand when it shook that day because the sun had something in it. He turned to Emmanuel. You took the copy. I saw it under your arm like a thief who had decided to marry his loot in church. A ripple, someone gasped. Someone else tried to pull the gasp back and stuff it in their pocket. Emmanuel laughed, a laugh that had worked in other rooms but found itself unemployed here. Old man, he said, forgetting courtesy, your eyes are not the only thing that shakes. This is a girl's trick. I have fed them, I have paid school levies. You sold our palm trees, Chiamaka said calmly. You sold our goats. You sold our yams when they were still dreams under the soil. You should be grateful, he snapped. Your mother was too soft. A woman alone cannot carry land. She cannot stand on the ridge and argue with men. I stood, I argued, you ate. We swallowed shame and called it yam, she replied. It has not digested. The elder lifted both hands like a referee too tired to pretend he wasn't partial. Enough salt, he said. We need fire. He looked at the ring. We will judge this, not with anger's mouth but with truth's teeth. They gathered by the Iroko where judgments that wanted to last were hung like mats to be beaten. Chiamaka felt her legs tremble only when she sat. The earth noticed and steadied her quietly. She placed the paper on the upturned mortar that served as a table. Emmanuel stood across from her, his chest rising and falling like a cockerel who has mistaken posture for argument. People formed rows with their bodies. The ones who had borrowed money from him stood where they could be seen agreeing with him. The ones who owed him nothing chose shade. The elder asked questions the way a hoe asks the ground, pressing, prying, not satisfied with the first answer. Who witnessed the first boundary? He asked. Names emerged like fish from a net, 2 already dead, 1 too far away. 1 presently leaning on a stick and smiling at the memory of a day when he had been useful. They called him, and he came with the leisure of someone who knows that time is no longer his master. He squinted at the drawing, then at the horizon, then at Emmanuel. I told you that night, he said without preamble, do not take what grief has loosened, it will tighten and choke you. He sighed as if the air had become expensive. You did not hear. Emmanuel's voice went low and dangerous, the voice of a man who wears charm until it tears. Why is this village determined to embarrass me? He asked. I took care of them. The girl should be in school, not in the square acting like a widow. She is a widow, the midwife said suddenly, widow of a living theft. The elder lifted the beads gently with 2 fingers. These, he said, were on her mother's neck the day we carried her to the church to stand with her husband like 2 tall palm trees promising not to bend in opposite directions. He placed them back, as if returning something to a river after borrowing it. A woman who hides beads does so to keep her neck honest. A man who hides them does not know the weight of beauty. It should have been enough. In a world where words behave, it would have been, but the world has many children and not all of them listen the same way. A few men muttered about family dignity. A woman in the second row whispered that Chiamaka should have waited a year. Someone in the back said, what of it? The land feeds the family whether in his name or hers. And then, as if summoned by the need to confuse what had begun to clarify, Emmanuel reached into his wrapper and produced a crumpled paper with a stamp the colour of tired plantain. You want paper? He sneered. Here, I went to the council. I made it official. The elder took it carefully the way one holds a snake that may or may not remember it has teeth. He read, he frowned, he read again. This is newer than the truth, he said finally, and it speaks a different language. He looked at the catechist. Who collected this fee? The catechist licked his lips the way a man does when his mouth has remembered a debt his soul does not want to pay. They come, he said vaguely. They bring things, we sign things. So the church's ink knows the weight of goats, the midwife murmured. Good, today its tongue will know the taste of dust. The elder did not raise his voice. He folded both papers, old and new, together as if they were two stubborn children who must now share a bed. We will not let a later stamp silence an earlier boundary, he said. We will not let a man's convenience eat a woman's inheritance. He turned to Emmanuel. Return what you can, count what you cannot, bring money, bring apology. Bring the beads you claimed were lost. Oh, he added with a softness that cut better than sharpness, she has already found that part of you. The square exhaled. For a heartbeat, relief put its head up and looked around hopefully. Then Emmanuel did what men do when cornered. He searched for fire in his pockets. No, he said. I will not be shamed by a child and an old man who cannot see the straightness of a line. He pointed at Chiamaka, and for a second his finger looked like the tip of a spear too light to be lethal. You have wanted this land for yourself since your mother learned to be weak. You have learned new words in school, now you want to taste their power, but words do not plant yam, men do. Chiamaka stood. She did not shout. Shouting would have made her sound like him. She lifted her mother's note without unfolding it as if the foldedness itself were part of its truth. We planted yam with hands that bled, she said. We watered them with our own misnaming. When people asked how we were, we said fine because to say otherwise would have required them to know where to put their sympathy. You took what we grew because you were taller and louder. Today I am not taller. Today I am not louder. Today I am finished being quiet. Someone clapped one pair of hands only, then stopped as if embarrassed by its honesty. The elder nodded once, an old tree acknowledging a young wind. We will write this, he said, with a pen that does not drink goat blood, with witnesses who remember how to be ashamed. He began to call names. Men and women stepped forward reluctantly, as if justice were a bowl of soup they had already eaten enough of. Emmanuel left before the list was finished. He turned his back on the square and walked quickly, his hands tight at his sides. No one followed him with comfort. A few followed him with eyes which are heavier. When he reached the compound, he went straight to the room where he kept the leftovers of his victories, the cracked calculator that could not calculate the cost of sleep, the notebooks that mistook neatness for innocence, the hidden small gourd of money that he had promised the gods he would use for a good thing someday and had kept teaching someday to wait. For a wild moment he considered fire. Fire simplifies, but fire also tells on you. He sat in the dimness and learned what it feels like when a room listens to your breathing like a judge. By evening, the square's energy had thinned into household versions of the same argument. People cooked while retelling. People tied headscarves while choosing sides. The midwife brought Chiamaka a bowl of pepper soup so full of fish that it looked like generosity pretending to be medicine. Eat, she said. Today your voice ran a long distance. Tomorrow, Chiamaka said quietly, I will run farther. You will not run alone, the old woman replied, as if statting a weather report the sky had already agreed to. Night came with a slow hand. The stars were stingy as if hoarding their light for a festival. Chiamaka sat outside the house, the beads warm now against her skin, the paper resting in her lap like a pet that had decided to choose her. From the road, footsteps approached and then hesitated as if unsure whether their welcome had expired. A girl's voice, thin, brave, said, Sister. Chiamaka looked up. It was Ngozi, Emmanuel's daughter, 14 like her face an argument between shame and longing. I'm sorry, Ngozi said, the words tumbling. He said not to come, he said you are ungrateful, he said. She stopped, swallowed, started again. When Mama was alive, she gave me groundnut and I did not say thank you properly. I want to say it now, thank you. She extended a small cloth bundle with both hands like a peace treaty drawn by children. Inside were cola nuts and 2 oranges so bright they seemed to remember a better sky. From my mother, she whispered. She hid them for you, I found them when I was sweeping. Don't tell him, he will, she didn't finish. Chiamaka stood and pulled her into an embrace that felt like a bridge being built with bones. You are not him, she said into the other girl's hair. You are not him. Ngozi began to cry, the kind of cry that starts in the shoulders and travels down. When she left, the night felt less crowded. The next day Emmanuel did not appear before noon. When he did, he walked like a man who had memorized a speech but lost the paper. He placed a calabash at the elder's feet, the rattle inside coins annoyed to find themselves apologizing. I will return the rest, he said, eyes on the ground. He reached into his wrapper again and produced a folded paper with a reluctant stamp. I will go to the council. I will cancel this. It was a mistake of hunger. He spoke the last word like a foreigner, tasting a local pepper. And the trees you cut, someone called. They will not return, he said, but the money will, and the goats, and he looked up finally at Chiamaka, and I will say the words we pretend do not matter because they cannot be eaten. I am sorry. There was no applause. There was no chorus. There was the small, important sound of people shifting their weight from one leg to the other when a burden they didn't admit they were sharing lessens by an inch. The elder took the calabash and did not bless it out loud, because sometimes blessing is not what a thing needs. It needs accountability. For weeks there was the everyday work of mending. Money arrived in small, reluctant handfuls. A goat, led by a rope, looked offended at being recategorized. The council's stamp came back with an apology that mentioned oversight, and not the way goats make ink behave. Men avoided Emmanuel's eyes in the square and greeted him at funerals, because hypocrisy loves tradition. Women spoke Chiamaka's name with a tone that mixed pride and warning. She had done a necessary thing. The cost clung to her like smoke after a cooking fire. One late afternoon, sitting by her mother's grave, Chiamaka traced the beads along her collarbone and spoke aloud, not as prayer, not as testimony, but as conversation picking up where silence had interrupted it. I promised, she said. I broke it open. The grave did not answer with a voice. It answered with the slow fullness in her chest that told her the promise had not been a rope around her neck but a road under her feet. School reopened. The headmaster, a man who wore his sympathy like a tie, visible, unnecessary, determined, called her to his office. We heard, he said, clearing his throat as if words might be stuck there from last term. You spoke. That is good. He offered her a scholarship half the size of her need and twice the size of what he could afford. She accepted with the dignity of someone who knows that gratitude is not servitude. At home, she gathered her books from the trunk, where she had hidden them the day her uncle first measured their lives in yam heaps. The pages smelled like rain attempting reconciliation. Some nights she still woke to the old reflex, reaching for a silence that was no longer hers to carry. On those nights she would go outside and sit where her mother had sat to peel cassava, the knife flashing like a slim moon in her mind, and she would tell the darkness a story, not the crying kind, not the victorious kind, just true and long and patient. She learned that the body remembers how to speak even after a long famine of words. Emmanuel kept his distance. When their paths crossed by the stream, he nodded once like a man acknowledging a debt he pays in installments. Ngozi waved the shy wave of someone who has decided that inheritance is not destiny. The midwife visited often, always without warning, always with something too simple to be a gift, half a loaf, 2 eggs, a joke that did not ask you to laugh to do its work. The day the first rain came, real rain, not the shy rehearsal showers, Chiamaka took her mother's beads off and polished them with oil until they glowed the way memory does when it has chosen not to punish you. She placed them in a small calabash and set it on the shelf above the cooking stones. Rest, she told them. Your work today is remembrance. She looked at the folded note one last time and slipped it between the pages of her mathematics book at the chapter on long division. It felt right, the idea that some things take time and patient cutting to be made whole in a new way. At dusk, voices floated from the square, women laughing the laughter that had been rationed for months, men arguing about football with more passion than agriculture, children practicing a song for no one in particular. Chiamaka tied her wrapper and stepped into the road that led there, her feet light in a way that did not betray the weight she still carried. She knew grief would keep visiting, that betrayal leaves fingerprints that no soap can teach the skin to forget completely. She knew some people would watch her now, with the respect reserved for those who have made themselves costly. She knew others would say her name the way you say pepper, with caution. But she also knew her mother's last command had turned into a different kind of inheritance, one that did not need goats or stamps or a crowd to make it real. She felt for the shape of it inside her, and found it had the gentleness of a hand resting, not pushing, not pulling, just reminding. On the way to the square, she passed the midwife sitting on her stool like a small god who had never asked for worship. The old woman looked up without moving her head. The ground, she said, likes it when people say the right thing on it. Chiamaka smiled. I am learning its language. Good, the midwife said. Teach others or don't just keep speaking. Silence is always recruiting. A gust of wind came, not strong enough to be story-worthy, just strong enough to rearrange a few leaves and make the smell of rain step forward. Chiamaka lifted her face to it, closed her eyes, and for a moment imagined her mother's palm there, warm and exact. When she opened her eyes, the road looked the same and also better. At the square, someone called her name with the exact affection she had been starving for since the world had taught her to conserve it. She turned toward the sound, toward the small bright work of living, toward the long math of making loss multiply into something that could feed more than pain. And as she walked, she whispered, not as a tear, not as a plea, but as a statement laid carefully on the table of the day. I did not carry your silence, I carried you. That night the air in Chiamaka village was restless. The frogs croaked in uneven chorus, the crickets sang too loudly, and even the trees seemed to shift uneasily as if they knew something had changed. Chiamaka lay on her mat staring at the roof, her mind still running through the square, through Emmanuel's eyes when the paper was unfolded, through her mother's beads warm against her chest. Sleep came in fragments. The kind that brings dreams too real to be dreams. She saw her mother sitting by the fire, peeling cassava with the patience of someone who knew time was never truly hers. She saw her father standing by the farm ridge, his hoe digging into the earth, his sweat bright under the sun, his face proud. She saw them both looking at her, not smiling, not speaking, but present, like roots under soil. When she reached for them, the dream broke, and she woke with tears on her cheeks. At dawn she rose before the rooster, fetched water from the stream, and returned to the compound. She stood in front of the small hut where Emmanuel used to keep his tools. The door was ajar, the inside smelling of damp earth and forgotten promises. She felt a strange calm wash over her. This was her father's house, her mother's house, her house, and no lie, no forged paper, no betrayal would erase that truth. By mid-morning, word had spread that Emmanuel was preparing to leave for a while. Some said he was going to the city to chase contracts. Others whispered he was running from shame. He avoided the square, avoided the elders, avoided even the church. But he could not avoid himself. His shadow followed him everywhere, whispering louder than his own excuses. Ngozi, his daughter, came to see Chiamaka more often now. At first she came shyly, bringing small gifts, firewood, groundnuts, sometimes just her company. Then she began to come without pretense, sitting with Chiamaka while they shelled beans, their laughter slowly learning to come without guilt. He is still my father, Ngozi said one evening, her voice breaking. But I do not want to be like him. Chiamaka took her hand. We are not doomed to be our parents' mistakes, she said. We are allowed to be their correction. The words gave Ngozi a courage she had not known she possessed. Soon she began to answer her father more boldly, to ask questions when he lied, to stand her ground when he tried to silence her. Emmanuel's anger flared, but it burned weaker each time, like a fire running out of wood. The village, too, was changing. Where once people had whispered about Chiamaka as the girl cursed with silence, they now spoke of her with cautious respect. Women began to send their daughters to sit with her, to learn how to grind cassava without bitterness, to carry water without complaint. Men lowered their voices when she passed, some with shame, some with admiration. Even the catechist, whose sermons had once painted her father's death as her brother's curse, now chose his words more carefully, fearful of being called to account as Emmanuel had been. But respect does not erase loneliness. At night, when the lamps went out and the compound fell silent, Chiamaka still felt the ache of absence pressing against her chest. She missed her father's voice, her mother's touch, the sound of laughter that used to spill out of their house like sunlight. She missed being a child with no burden heavier than fetching water or chasing goats. Sometimes she curled up on her mat and let herself weep until sleep finally took her. One evening, as the Harmattan winds returned, she sat by the fire with Ngozi roasting maize. The flames crackled, the smoke strung their eyes, but their laughter mingled with the sparks. Then from the road came a sound that froze them both, footsteps steady and familiar. Chiamaka's heart raced. Could it be? She rose, stepping out into the darkness, and there at the bend of the path stood Nana, her father's nephew, the cousin who had been exiled by whispers. His shoulders were broader, his face harder, but his eyes carried the same sorrow she remembered. Chiamaka, he said softly, his voice trembling, I heard what happened. I heard how you stood when no one else would. You carried the silence I could not break. For a moment she could not move. Then she ran to him and they embraced, two branches from the same tree bent by storms but not broken. Tears ran freely, soaking into the dust beneath their feet. Behind them Ngozi watched, her eyes wide, realizing that family could wound but also heal, that betrayal was not the final word. The next day, when Nana walked into the square beside Chiamaka, heads turned, whispers spread, and hearts stirred. The story was not finished. In fact, it was only beginning. And as the ube tree swayed in the wind, its roots deep in the earth that had tasted both lies and truth, it seemed to whisper a promise. The silence had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The road to Chiamaka had never felt so heavy beneath footsteps. When Nana returned, the village stirred as if an old wound had been reopened. Some watched him pass with narrowed eyes, whispering the same rumors that had driven him into exile years ago. Others only nodded quietly, as though ashamed they had ever believed those whispers. His presence was not just a man coming home, it was the return of a truth the village had tried to bury. When he entered Chiamaka's compound, her heart leapt before she could name why. He was broader now, his skin darker from sun and labor, but his eyes carried the same sorrow she remembered from when he had left. They embraced in silence, two branches bent by storms meeting again, both changed, both scarred, but still part of the same tree. That night they sat by the fire, the flames licking the darkness, the smoke curling into the night like questions without answers. "I heard of your mother," Nana said quietly, his voice breaking. "I heard what Emmanuel did." Chiamaka's eyes glistened. "I carried her silence," she whispered, "but it almost killed me. I could not let it bury me too." He nodded, and they sat in the quiet grief that needed no words. But the village could not stay quiet. The next morning whispers began again. "He has returned," some said darkly. "The cursed boy who killed his father with words." Others shook their heads. "No, look at him. Does guilt carry itself so steadily? Maybe we were wrong." The village was a river of tongues, flowing in two directions at once, restless, unwilling to settle. Emmanuel heard of Nana's return before the sun had fully risen. He spat into the dust, packing his compound. "So he dares," he muttered. "After all these years he dares." He stormed into the square later that day, his voice loud, his arms raised as though to command the sky. "This is insult upon insult," he shouted. "First the girl accuses me in public, and now the boy returns to shame us again. How long will this village endure lies?" But Elder Okafor, who had once stayed silent out of weariness, now rose to his feet. His voice was steady, his staff tapping the ground like punctuation. "Lies?" he asked. "Or truth we were too cowardly to face? How many times, Emmanuel, will you demand silence from those you wound?" The crowd shifted, restless. For the first time, the tide of whispers leaned away from Emmanuel. A council was called. The Iroko tree, which had listened to more judgments than any living man, stood witness again as elders, women, and young men gathered. The air was heavy, the tension thick as palm oil in Harmattan. Chiamaka stood with the folded note her mother had left. Nana stood beside her, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his side. Across from them, Emmanuel stood alone, his smile strained, his eyes flashing. The elder began, "We are here not for one quarrel but for many, for land, for beads, for silence, for exile. The ground remembers, today we will remember with it." Chiamaka stepped forward first. Her voice did not tremble. "My mother kept silent because she thought silence was peace, but silence only fed betrayal. She left me her words in this note." She held it high, her mother's handwriting visible even to those who could not read. She wrote that Emmanuel took what was not his and that he lied. She touched the beads at her neck, their red glow defying the sun. "She hid these to remind me that silence is not inheritance, truth is." Then Nana spoke. His voice was deep, worn, but strong. "The night my father died, I quarreled with him, yes, but words are not poison. My brother, Obira, used my grief to exile me. Emmanuel fed those lies, fattened them, and made me a curse in your mouths. I carried that exile like a wound. But today I return not to beg, not to hide, but to speak. You buried me with lies. I am here to live again with truth." The square hummed, some nodded, some frowned. But when Ngozi, Emmanuel's own daughter, stepped forward, her small body trembling, her eyes wet, the hum broke into silence. "He is my father," she began, her voice cracking. "But I cannot carry his sins any more. I have watched him cheat, I have watched him lie. I have watched him steal from us all. I am tired of silence." She broke down, sobbing into Chiamaka's arms. The square erupted in gasps. Emmanuel's face turned red. His voice rose, desperate, sharp. "Lies, all lies, you will not destroy me with the words of children." He slammed his staff against the ground, but his rage only revealed his guilt. The elders shook their heads. Even the catechist, who had once stood with him, muttered a prayer under his breath and stepped back. The judgment was swift. Emmanuel was stripped of his land rights, ordered to repay what he had stolen, and shunned from the gatherings of elders. His voice, once so loud in the square, now fell into silence, his shadow shrinking as he walked away alone. Chiamaka stood tall. Nana's name was cleared, restored by witnesses who finally spoke of what they had seen years before. The exile that had haunted him was lifted. The village, shamed by its own silence, bowed its head. In the days that followed, women began to tell their own stories. A widow spoke of her brother-in-law stealing her harvest. A young wife spoke of her husband beating her into silence. The square that had once been a place of whispers became a place of voices. Truth, once feared, now grew bold. One evening, Chiamaka walked to her mother's grave. She knelt, placing the beads gently on the soil. "Mamma," she whispered, her tears falling freely, "I carried your silence, but I did not let it bury me. It became my voice, and now the village has heard it." The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment she swore she felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, steady, proud. She rose, her heart lighter. Beside her Nana stood, his eyes wet, his voice low. "The silence is broken," he said. "The curse is ended." Together they turned back toward the village where new stories were waiting to be told. And as the ube tree swayed in the wind, its roots deep in the earth that had tasted both lies and truth, it whispered a promise to the night. Silence may last for a season, but truth endures forever.